Hi, everybody. I am Craig Hardesty with Out on Film, and I want to welcome you to In Conversations with at the festival. I am delighted to have with us today Kathryn Beranich with the film that you just saw, and our own Belinda Hernandez, and who's going to moderate a conversation that I think all of you will enjoy. So thank you for joining us. And Belinda, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Craig. Hello, Kathryn. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
Yeah, for those just joining, we just saw the screening of the unlikely story of the Lesbians of First Friday. I really enjoyed this movie. It was light, it was sweet. I laughed out loud at a few things in there. The Olympics, we'll get to that at some point. But yeah, it was just a well done story on a piece of history that I did not know about. For those who may be looking at this at a later date and haven't yet seen the film, why don't you give us just a very brief synopsis of what you captured here?
All right. First Friday was an organization that came together at the beginning of 1980, basically, and continued through the decade in Roanoke, Virginia, which is a pretty small little city. It's about 150,000, I think, in southwestern Virginia. And I moved there from a bustling urban center, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I thought I was a big city kid coming to this little town. And a number of other people had moved there for their careers. So when I moved, it was 1977. And so we all just slowly found each other, because it was a time when you totally were closeted. And my biggest fear was that I would lose my job. And I was horrified at that prospect. But we got together and we started meeting the first Friday of every month at this restaurant, and decided that we wanted to build from there. And so in trying to come up with a name, some not so creative person came up with First Friday, and it told the story, but it was never anything that I could embrace, but well, until now, I guess I embrace it. Anyway, so once that restaurant closed, we continued having a party on the first Friday of every month at different people's houses. And it was open to any lesbian, and people from the hollers and the mountains and little towns surrounding Roanoke, just flocked in for it. It was great, and it really built. And then we started to spread our wings a bit, and we had fancy dress balls every year, and we had a newsletter. It was a quarterly newsletter. And then we had the Roanoke Valley Women's Retreat, which was this weekend camp out that was just a blast. And that went from the first one, there were 30 women there. And by like the third or fourth, we had upwards of 200, and we're just spread. And it was a blast.
Yeah, you did a really nice job telling the story. We had talked a minute ago about chronologically. So this group, it just sort of happened organically, right? I mean, just a few women meeting together, and it seemed like everything just snowballed from there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there were some students from Virginia Tech, which was about 45 miles down the road, and some former professors from Tech wandered into it, and a business owner, just all different people. And we just I knew her and she knew her, and I know that, and we just would tell each other about it. And then it just grew into this little core group, and we were so energized, and we just felt like we could do anything. And we tried whatever we thought of, we tried to do, and we were usually pretty successful. We weren't about making money, just we wanted to break even, and we always did that. But it was just about community, and it wasn't political in a political sense, but its mere existence was pretty political for the time.
Well, how did you, and this was long before social media, long before technology and cell phones. How did the word spread? How did you, and before the newsletter, how was it, just word of mouth, or how did people know, and how did it start getting traction?
Yeah, we had quite a mailing list, and a Rolodex, basically. And then once we put it on computer, we had a dot matrix printer that would print out all the labels. So before the newsletter, we would send out just directions to where First Friday was going to be, you know, like for 3 months in advance. And yeah, and then just word of mouth, really. The first big ball that we did was a surprise birthday party for the matriarch of our group. And it was her 50th birthday. And so we contacted people that we knew. It was just like everybody's phone book was out. And then from there, I think that might have been sort of the nugget of the mailing list. And we went, you know, and it just grew from there. And we started the newsletter early on. I don't remember what year it was, but we recognized that we needed an outlet for communication, communicate to people. And
were you surprised when, as time went on, and then from having the First Friday and then having the retreats, people were touching in the film on, some came from the Outer Banks, some came from, you know, Tennessee, some came from the Carolinas. Were you really surprised at how people from other states had found out that, wow, there's this amazing women's group and it meets on a regular basis?
Yeah, yes, and it was awesome to have like a big group from Durham would come up from North Carolina. And the Outer Banks were a lot of friends of friends. But then a big group from Richmond would come, and I didn't know any of those people. So it was always just amazing to see who would pop up and where they were from. And we would bring in, we always had a performer at the retreats, and they usually were from New York or something, you know, they were from the circuit. And people were delighted with that because they didn't have the opportunity to see these people. They could buy an Olivia record, but they didn't have an opportunity for a concert or anything unless we produced it.
You had some pretty big names: Kate Clinton, Lucy Tremblay. You had some pretty big name performers come to Roanoke, Virginia.
Yeah, Alex Dobkin, June Millington, Linda Tillery was a favorite of ours. Yeah, it was awesome. And because we treated them really well, I think that they spread the word to, you know, other performers that it was worth their while to come.
Yeah, yeah. Well, talk a little bit about being the filmmaker, being the director. When did it strike you, wow, I need to document this. I need to put this together. And then the second part of that question is, that was great. I'm guessing it was 8mm film footage, or it was, I don't know, I'm guessing, and then great still photos. So the first question would be, when did it strike you, I need to put this together? And then talk about using all that great stuff from old footage.
Well, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a group in Roanoke, based at Roanoke College, started to put together the Southwest Virginia Gay and Lesbian History Archives or something, and it's audio. And they started interviewing, you know, people from the area, their backstories and stuff, and it was mostly men, and they were having a really hard time. They said, you know, we figured there must have been lesbians here. And so they dug around, and suddenly somebody landed on First Friday, and I got a phone call one day, and I was thrilled, and, you know, I turned the woman on to a couple other people, and now we've all been interviewed and stuff. And I was feeling so great, like, wow, finally somebody is recognizing that we existed and what we did and how cool it was. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is my story to tell.
Right.
I was involved with it from the beginning, and like, I would say, I don't know, maybe 50% of the pictures are mine, because I was always taking pictures. And so that's where a lot came from. But we also videotaped at all the retreats. And when I left Roanoke in 1989, I knew I couldn't take all these VHS tapes with me. And so I remember handing them off to someone, and to this day, I don't know who it was. I cannot remember her name. I can see her, but I can't remember her name, and I haven't been able to find them. And I was sort of, you know, my tail was between my legs, like, how could I have let go of that? And one day I got a phone call from a friend, and she said, Kathryn, I've got some movies that I shot at the first 2 retreats. Would you be interested? And I like to have died. I was so thrilled. And so she sent them to me, and that's what really makes the retreat section so alive, using all that footage. So that was a big gift. And then we just started asking around. Anybody who I interviewed, we asked. And you'll see in the credits Nancy Kelly's name. I have her mentioned as associate producer. And Nancy was everything that I wasn't doing, she was doing. And so like she made lots of phone calls and got in touch with people. And she scanned all of the pictures, except mine, but she scanned all the pictures. And we would travel with it. And she's based in Durham now. And so I would fly into Durham, and then we'd go on a road trip to do interviews. And she'd take her scanner with her. And while I was interviewing, she'd be scanning the pictures. And we were just shaking the trees to get visuals. And yeah, and so that's how that all came together.
Yeah.
It was, just a gift, everybody lending their stuff to us.
It was a really well done piece, weaving the current interviews with the pictures of when they were younger, or they would reference, for example, the Olympics and the sack races. I mean, it just really all flowed and worked well together. Yeah. When you started contacting some of the women from First Friday and said, you know what, do you want to do an interview? What was the reception like when you said, I'm working on a documentary for this?
Yes. To a woman, they were just like, yes, oh, absolutely. What can I do to help you? You know, somebody lent me lights when I was in Roanoke, and you know, things like that. It was, everybody was just so on board and so excited. And early on, I started working on this. I can't remember what year it was now. It took me 3.5 years. So it was something like 2018, I think, that I first started. But we had a great reunion that spring. I started in the fall. And that spring, it was just a gathering of people. And it was just so much fun to see folks you hadn't seen in 30 years, literally. And a lot of people, most everybody has left. Most of the, I say that and then I question it, but you know, at least half of the women have left Roanoke, half of the women who are involved as organizers in First Friday. And so to get back together, and there were women there from Portland and Seattle and LA and some other places. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But it was so awesome. And yeah, everybody was so excited that it was happening. And I had a GoFundMe page to help me with my post-production costs, and people were lovely with that.
Yeah, yeah. It reminded me of what some of the women were talking about, that everything was a positive in the group. Everybody had a can-do attitude. It somewhat seems like that attitude mirrored what you just explained. You know, people are like, yes, we'll do it. We'll take part in it. That to me is a testament to some of these women and who they are. Would you say?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of really successful career women, you know, got a park ranger, and we've got, you know, teachers and psychologists and, you know, all sorts of different people. And we just took our skills. And, you know, it was a time when women were just getting into men's jobs, if you will. Like every job that I had, I was the first woman at that place that they'd ever hired for that job. So constantly having to prove yourself and constantly having to, you know, go 150%. And so when you're used to working at that level, then when you're, you know, for the man, if you will, and you're doing something, you know, with these women who you love, yeah, you just take all of that passion with you. And it was,
for folks who may be looking at this either live now, Kathryn got her start in television, in local news as a director, and especially in the late 70s, early 80s, it was definitely a man's world. So I'm sure you broke some glass ceilings back in the day. So take me back to that time in Roanoke in the late 70s and early 80s. This was a safe space for lesbians to meet, but outside of the safe space, what was the city of Roanoke like at that time? I mean, people had to live closeted. Did they have any gay bars? Was there any socializing outside of this group that people did?
softball, for sure. Bowling. There were a lot of bowling leagues. But a lot of the women who were involved in the sports, I would say, were a little more closeted than some of us. Like, I came out as a lesbian feminist. So, having come out in that context was a little different than some of the other people that I was meeting in Roanoke, who were very, very scared and closeted, because it's a real religious place. Roanoke has churches everywhere, and most everybody was raised, if not Baptist, something akin to that. Mm-hmm. And like at one point, as an example, there was a church that had been empty for a while, and somebody bought it and opened it up as a bar, and there were women who wouldn't go there because they couldn't go to it inside of a church that it was a bar. It just didn't work for them. And I couldn't, it took a long time for me to understand that as a recovering Catholic. Anyway.
Is that where Sister Mary Kathryn, was that the inspiration for Sister Mary Kathryn?
Oh, yes, it was. And
I laughed out loud at that.
She spells her name with a C, Kathryn with a C. Mine is with a K, because it's Sister MC.
Oh. Brilliant.
Behind it all.
Brilliant.
That was fun, because I was, tasked with the rules and regulations for the retreat, and there's nothing more boring, other than the firm that holds the Academy Award. So I would just try to come up with something that would make it light and playful, and it worked, and people loved her, and so I continued it every year. Now, one thing that I couldn't include in the doc. One year I had surgery and I was on crutches, and I didn't want Sister Mary Kathryn on crutches. She'd been on a cane, but I couldn't do it for whatever reason. And so I talked to my friends, Pam and Subi. Pam was interviewed. She's the rock and roll guitar player. And said, I need you to build me a monster Mary Kathryn, kind of like the Wizard of Oz. And it needs to be, big, her head, the mouth moves, and so I can stand up inside of it, and then there will be a reveal. And they did it. Brilliant. But the story took so long to tell, and I did,
right.
He was left on the cutting room floor.
Oh, man.
That was pretty awesome. But it was my only way that I could get around doing it, was she had to make some kind of appearance, kind of like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. I love it. I bet that was hysterical, though. So tell me, how was the retreat born? Whose idea was it? A light bulb moment, or was it just the natural offshoot saying, you know what, this is about female empowerment? It's more than just a once a month get together for a Friday night and some drinks. What was the whole impetus for the retreat being born out of this?
A bunch of us were sitting around the restaurant, and the restaurant was the Taylor House. And somebody said, I think Kathy Brahoni said, wouldn't it be cool to have a weekend camp out? We could, get a bunch of women together and, have this camp out. And we were like, yeah, what do you want me to do? And we all just kind of, we took notes, we decided what we needed to get done. People volunteered for everything. And we just went into it blind that first year. But we knew that we wanted workshops and entertainment. And we had the Lesbian History Archives. Joan Nessel came down maybe the first 2 years, and did a presentation about the importance of saving your stuff, your pictures and your posters and everything, and all. And then, we had, I can't remember who the entertainment was the very first year, but it was a very organic thing, and it was such a blast. And we pulled it off because there was only 30 of us there, and probably 28 of us organized. There weren't that many just campers, but And then there were 2 women who refused to camp, and they stayed in hotels somewhere. But it was such a blast that we were like, we are doing this again. And that next year there were about 120 women. And then we had to leave that camp because they found out. Somebody had written an article about it, about the retreat, and they mentioned Camp Carysbrook. And somebody who knew the owners saw it and said, hey, did you know that? And I would guess that a couple of lesbians owned the camp, but I don't know for sure. But they weren't having it because, you know, if it became known as a camp that lesbians used, then they'd lose their business.
Right. And yet that did not break the spirit of this group, because the group went to look for another place. They said no. And you all were like, you know what, we're just going to put it out there. We're lesbians. Yeah.
Yeah. That happened a little later on, you know, after we'd been to a couple, 3 camps. You know, I can't remember when that was, but after Camp Carysbrook, we were maybe at a Boy Scout camp, and then we were at some other kind of camp. And for whatever reasons, we didn't go back. One of them was, you know, kind of filthy, and we left it so clean, you know, we had to clean it. And then we left it looking good. So, yeah, it was a while before we actually came out, and Gail approached people and said, you know, we're lesbians, this is what we want.
Right.
And she knows the woman who turned her down. She knew her then and really thought that we'd get a yes. And then we didn't. But years later, the woman said to her, I'm so sorry.
Well.
Yeah. And it all came back around.
I have a question from someone in the chat box. What do you say to younger LGBTQ people today about the power of community and being together?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time right now, because people just coming out, they aren't faced with not being able to tell people. You know, I mean, it's like people come out all the time, and, you know, there's lots of love. Not to say that, you know, parents aren't still freaked out and things like that, but our community was like our family. And now the need for it isn't the same. But I'd like to suggest that y'all pull together, you know, some community events, because it's wonderful and it's so nice. And we were all, I don't know if everybody would have called themselves separatists. I mean, I called myself a social separatist because I worked with a lot of guys, but socially. But because it's so different now, I mean, they don't even like the word lesbian I have a 17-year-old daughter, and so she keeps me abreast of these things.
Yeah.
And the word dyke, some people love it, some people hate it. And I just embrace all that stuff. So, you know, it's hard for me to relate to those young kids. But I want to, and I want to suggest that they, you know, try to get active with communities. You know, Meetup, you know, the Meetup app thing, that to me is the closest that I've seen. And I wasn't involved, I'm not really involved with it now, but I didn't really know about it before the pandemic. And so now seeing it, and there's lots of Zoom get-togethers and things like that. And I think that that's great. And I think that once we can be with each other in the flesh again,
right.
You know, that could morph into something like that.
Yeah. I really like how you captured in this film what happens when women come together. There was not the hierarchical structure of the organizational structure, and everybody just chipped in, and it seemed like it just seemed like there was so much empowerment there with these women. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, being a young lesbian when all this was happening? Did you all realize that this is something pretty special?
We were having so much fun. We were drinking a lot of beer, and we'd get together for these meetings on somebody's front porch. In fact, Gail has a story about the time she lived across the street from Highland Park, which was, it's kind of the center of Old Southwest, which was, you know, more historic neighborhood, and a lot of gay people live there. Anyway, she was in the park one day and ran into a guy walking his dog, and he was a neighbor, and they were chatting, and he said, where do you live? And she said, oh, I'm right over there, that house with the big porch. He goes, oh, the home for women or something. I mean, because he had seen it out there so often, he just assumed that this was some kind of a halfway house or something. Anyway, that doesn't answer your question. We were just having so much fun that we weren't, and we loved how successful everything was. And so it just kept us going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And it had a run for about 10 years, you said, right?
Yeah.
And the way that it seemed like it just dissolved, it seems like it dissolved organically, like it started organically. Can you talk a little bit about that? And was it bittersweet? What was the ranging emotion from what was the feedback you heard from other women?
Well, as women started to leave Roanoke for their various reasons, my partner at the time got a job teaching in Alabama, and I followed her there. That's why I left, but other people were leaving and going to the Outer Banks or Norfolk, just for whatever reason, a life change, whatever. And the one thing that First Friday didn't do very well was we didn't bring up a younger generation. We didn't teach other people how to do the things that we were doing. And so, like one woman in the piece says, we didn't realize what big shoes they were to fill. And that's my one regret, is that we weren't able to pass the baton and keep it going. But yeah, it was pretty organic. We weren't talking to each other about leaving, or yeah, I'm thinking of leaving town. Oh, me too. You know, none of that. You know, it just for whatever was happening in our lives, people were just dispersing, and couples were breaking up. That played in a little bit.
It happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you do a really good job capturing this piece of lesbian history that I didn't know about. Who would have thought Roanoke? And like I said, you had a 10-year run with the group. What message would you want to give to some of the younger next generation of lesbians and women who are part of the LGBTQ community that, you know, as far as history, why is it so important that you think this needs to be documented?
Yeah. I think that there's very little out there about lesbians in the late 70s, early 80s. And I think it's important that we know our history, that we know that there were, you know, women doing all sorts of great stuff. I've been trying to research more about what else was going on, you know, communities, because whenever I show the film, people are like, oh, we had a community like that in XYZ, you know, wherever they were living. And it's so great because I realized this is a microcosm of what was going on all over the country. And so it is about First Friday, but it's really about what lesbians were doing during the 80s. And that is our history, and it's rich. And I think that it's very important to share that and to record the history now, you know, what's happening. And, you know, I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yes, it does, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for capturing and telling such a really lovely story. The film, The Unlikely Story of the Lesbians of First Friday, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And director Kathryn Beranich, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you again for your time and continued success to you. But thank you so much for doing this interview with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet.